Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio. Thanks for joining me for meditation and sutra study. Tonight we will be engaging in a 15-minute guided meditation, a reading from a sutra, a dharma talk, followed by a Q&A. These teachings are offered free of charge, but if you'd like to make a contribution, information for PayPal and CashApp can be found in the description for this talk. If you'd like to do a deep dive into Buddhist training, check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. There's a link to a free sample chapter of the book also in the description for this talk, and it's available everywhere books are sold. So we'll start this evening with our guided meditation. It'll last 15 minutes. I'll keep time, so you don't need to worry about that. And in terms of sitting position, the only rule is you need to be comfortable and in a position where you can not move for about 15 minutes. If you'd like some instruction, you can place your left hand, palm up, in your lap, followed by your right hand, palm up, over the left. Back straight, so that you can breathe easily. And eyes can either be closed or pointed downwards at a 45-degree angle in order to eliminate distractions. So we'll start very simply by focusing on the breath, breathing in and out through the nose. This meditative breathing we're about to engage in has been used by meditators and yogis for thousands of years to calm their minds and drop into deep levels of samadhi. As we breathe in and out through the nose, with every inhale, we extend the belly button slightly, creating space in our stomach cavity for our diaphragm to drop down, giving us a nice deep lung full of air. And once we fall into what we think is a natural rhythm for our breathing, not forced, just a little deeper than usual, we'll add a visualization. With every inhale, air comes into our lungs. With every exhale, it goes out. And in our belly, in the space behind our belly button, we envision a fire. This fire represents our spiritual energy, and it's our favorite color. If we like blue, the energy is blue. If we like green, the energy is green. With every inhale, we bring air into our lungs. With every exhale, we blow on the fire of our spiritual energy like a campfire, making it a little bigger and a little brighter. And we're going to do this for about 2 minutes. I'll keep time. We're just going to breathe. And if our mind wanders, that's okay. We say hello to our thoughts and bring our focus back to the breathing and to the visualization. Wonderful. Now, as we continue with our breathing, in and out through the nose, we're going to visualize a channel of energy going down from our belly, down, down, down to the center of the earth. And once we get there, we'll find another energy that's identical to our own. So if our own spiritual energy is blue, the earth's energy is blue. If our own spiritual energy is red, the earth's energy is red. And then with every inhale, we'll pull energy up, up, up from the center of the earth into our belly, the seat of our spiritual power. And with every exhale, we'll blow on that spiritual energy, just like a campfire, making it even bigger and brighter. So we're pulling energy up from the earth with every inhale. And we're magnifying that energy with every exhale. Once again, feeding our spiritual power, growing our enlightenment and our Buddha nature. We'll do this for about 2 minutes. I'll keep time. No need to worry about that. And if our mind wanders, that's okay. We simply say hello to our thoughts and bring our focus back to the breath. Wonderful. You're all doing wonderfully, sitting so quietly and so still. Now we'll take things a step further. We're going to visualize a second energy channel going up from our hara, that space behind our belly button. It goes up past our solar plexus, past our throat, past our eyes, until it reaches the top of our head. So it's almost like we have our spiritual energy in our belly, and a pipe going down to the center of the earth, and a second pipe going up to the top of our head. And with every inhale, we're going to continue to pull energy up, up, up from the center of the earth into our belly. With every exhale, we're going to explode that energy up, 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 even further out the top of our heads until it showers down on us like a volcano, covering every inch of our bodies in healing spiritual light. We breathe the energy up from the center of the earth. We exhale the energy out of the top of our heads. We'll do this for about 2 minutes. I'll keep time. No need to worry about that. And if our mind wanders, that's okay. It's what minds do. We simply say hello to our thoughts and bring our focus back to our breathing, in and out through our nose, and back to the visualization. Good job. Now, as we continue with this practice, let's take a moment to just notice the flow of energy, reminding ourselves that we can do this anytime, any place, whether it's for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 minute. Whenever we need to call on our own spiritual power in times of stress, anger, fear, we can do so. But now it's time to bring the practice to the close. So we'll slowly, gently shut off the energy channel going to the top of our heads until the energy barely reaches our nose with every exhale, and it barely reaches our solar plexus. And finally, simply rest in our belly. And slowly, gently, we do the same with the energy channel that goes down to the center of the earth, pulling it up into ourselves. As we do this, perhaps we make a silent mental bow to the earth, thanking it for helping us in our practice, knowing that we can always call upon it when needed, that it always has energy to give. Until finally we end right where we started, with the energy in our belly, and with our breath. Breathing in, breathing out. And gently we come back into our bodies by leaning our heads to the left and then to the right and then to the left again, back and forth, focusing on the physical sensation in our neck. And then we come back to center. And if our eyes are closed when we're ready, and only when we're ready, we open them. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. Wonderful. Thank you so much for engaging in that practice with me. There's a great energy when we sit together like that and feed off of each other's enlightenment, helping each other along the path. So thank you. Next, we will move into the sutra study. We'll be reading from the Awakening of Faith Sutra. This will be our last week with the Awakening of Faith Sutra. Next week, we'll be starting in on the Nirvana Sutra, which is quite good. This is the BDK English Tripitaka translation. It's not required to have a copy of the sutras for these live streams, but it can be helpful if you'd like to follow along. And our reading starts on page 60. It's called The Aspiration for Enlightenment Through the Perfection of Faith. Question: by whom and through what kind of discipline can faith be perfected, so that the aspiration for enlightenment may be developed? Among those who belong to the group of the undetermined, there are some who, by virtue of their excellent capacity for goodness, developed through permeation, believe in the law of retribution of karma, and observe the 10 precepts. They loathe the suffering of samsara and wish to seek the supreme enlightenment. Having been able to meet the Buddhas, they serve them, honor them, and practice the faith. Their faith will be perfected after 10,000 eons. Their aspiration for enlightenment will be developed either through the instruction of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or because of their great compassion toward their suffering fellow beings, or from their desire to preserve the good teaching from extinction. Those who are thus able to develop their aspiration through the perfection of faith will enter the group of the determined and will never retrogress. They are called the ones who are united with the correct cause for enlightenment and who abide among those who belong to the Tathagata family. Translator's note: the group of the undetermined, those who have not established a non-retrogressive faith, i.e., those who repeatedly advance and retreat in the course of attaining enlightenment, or in mythological terms, those who have not received the assurance of attaining enlightenment by a certain Buddha. The exact nature of the 10 precepts differs in the different traditions of Buddhism. The following 10 are popularly accepted in the Mahayana tradition of the Far East: not to kill, not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to lie, and not to use flowery words, not to slander, not to be double-tongued, not to covet, not to give way to anger, not to harbor biased views. Eon is a translation of the Sanskrit kalpa, a unit of time, often said to be the time it would take for a celestial maiden who comes down to Earth once every 100 years to wear away an immense rock by brushing it with her sleeve. Such expressions, needless to say, should be taken symbolically. They are used sometimes in order to suggest the extreme difficulty of establishing correct faith, or sometimes to convey an entirely new sense of dimension. Often, a qualitative difference is expressed by an extremely exaggerated and quantitative expression. There are, however, people among those who belong to the group of the undetermined, this is going back to the text, whose capacity for goodness is slight and whose defilements have accumulated from the far distant past, are deep-rooted. Though they may also meet the Buddhas and honor them, they will develop the potentiality merely to be born as human beings, as dwellers in heaven, or as followers of the Hinayana. Even if they should seek after the Mahayana, they would sometimes progress and sometimes regress because of the inconsistent nature of their capacity. And also, there are some who honor the Buddhas and who, before 10,000 eons have passed, will develop an aspiration because of some favorable circumstances. These circumstances may be the viewing of the Buddha's corporeal forms, the honoring of monks, the receiving of instructions from the followers of the Hinayana, or the imitation of others' aspiration. But these types of aspiration are all inconsistent, for if the people who hold them meet with unfavorable circumstances, they will relapse and fall back into the stage of attainment for the followers of the Hinayana. Now, in developing the aspiration for enlightenment through the perfection of faith, what kind of mind is to be cultivated? Briefly speaking, 3 kinds can be discussed. The first is the mind characterized by straightforwardness, for it correctly mediates on the principle of suchness. The second is the mind of profundity, for there is no limit to its joyful accumulation of all kinds of goodness. The third is the mind filled with great compassion, for it wishes to uproot the sufferings of all sentient beings. Question. Earlier, it has been explained that the world of reality is one, that the essence of the Buddhas has no duality. Why is it that people who do not meditate of their own accord on suchness alone, but must learn to practice good deeds? Just as the precious gem is bright and pure in its essence, this is the answer, but is marred by impurities, so is a human being. Even if a person meditates on his precious nature, unless he polishes it in various ways by expedient means, he will never be able to purify it. The principle of suchness in human beings is absolutely pure in its essential nature, but it's filled with immeasurable impurity of defilements. Even if a person meditates on suchness, unless he makes an effort to be permeated by it in various ways by applying expedient means, he certainly cannot become pure. Since the state of impurity is limitless, pervading throughout all states of being, it is necessary to counteract and purify it by means of the practice of all kinds of good deeds. If a person does so, he will naturally return to the principle of suchness. As to the expedient means, there are, in short, 4 kinds. The first is the fundamental means to be practiced, that is to say, a person is to meditate on the fact that all things in their essential nature are unborn, divorcing himself from deluded views so that he does not abide in samsara. At the same time, he is to meditate on the fact that all things are the products of the union of the primary and coordinating causes, and that the effect of karma will never be lost. Accordingly, he is to cultivate great compassion, practice meritorious deeds, and accept and transform sentient beings equally, without abiding in nirvana, for he is to conform himself to the functions of the essential nature of reality, dharmata, which knows no fixation. Translator's note. The last clause is the immediate preceding paragraph, or in the immediately preceding paragraph, for he is to conform himself to can literally be translated as because he is to follow the non-abiding of the essential nature of reality, dharmata. The term non-abiding suggests freedom, spontaneity, non-attachment, non-dogmatism, etc. It is a way of life, a practical application of emptiness, shunyata, in a life situation encompassing both intellectual and affectional aspects. In this paragraph, 3 ideas are presented. First, faith in the absolute order. Second, the legitimate recognition of the phenomenal order where the law of capacity of causality operates. Third, the synthesis of 2 orders in a way of life for sentient beings, or synthesis of these 2 orders in a way of life for sentient beings. The second is the means of stopping evils. The practice of developing a sense of shame and repentance can stop all evils and prevent them from growing. For one is to conform oneself to the faultlessness of the essential nature of reality. The third is the means of increasing the capacity for goodness that has already been developed. That is to say, a person should diligently honor and pay homage to the 3 treasures and should praise, rejoice in, and beseech the Buddhas. Because of the sincerity of his love and respect for the 3 treasures, his faith will be strengthened and he will be able to seek the unsurpassed enlightenment. Furthermore, being protected, I lost my place. Furthermore, being protected by the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, he will be able to wipe out the hindrances of evil karma. His capacity for goodness will not retrogress because he will be conforming himself to the essential nature of reality, which is free from hindrances produced by stupidity. The fourth is the means of the great vow of universal salvation. This is to take a vow that one will liberate all sentient beings down to the last one, no matter how long it may take to cause them to attain the perfect nirvana. For one will be conforming oneself to the essential nature of reality, which is characterized by the absence of discontinuity. The essential nature of reality is all-embracing and pervades all sentient beings. It is everywhere, the same and one without duality. It does not distinguish this from that because it is, in the final analysis, in the state of quiescence, which means peace. When a bodhisattva develops this aspiration for enlightenment through faith, he will abide to a certain extent to realize the Dharmakaya. He will be able, rather, to a certain extent, to realize the Dharmakaya. Because of this realization of the Dharmakaya, and because he is led by the force of the vow, which he made to liberate all sentient beings, he is able to present 8 types of manifestation of himself for the benefit of all sentient beings. These are the descent from the Tusita heaven, the entrance into a human womb, the stay in the womb, the birth, the renunciation, the attainment of enlightenment, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, doctrine, and the entrance into nirvana. However, such a bodhisattva cannot be said to have perfectly realized the Dharmakaya, for he has not yet completely destroyed the outflowing evil karma that has been accumulated from his numberless existences in the past. He must suffer from slight misery deriving from the state of his birth. However, this is due not to his being fettered by karma, but to his freely made decision to carry out the great vow of universal salvation in order to understand the suffering of others. Translator's note. The 8 types of manifestation reflect the mythic account of the life of Shakyamuni Buddha. In the usual account, however, a phase called the subduing of Mara, the evil tempter, appears after the renunciation, and the stay in the womb is omitted. To turn the wheel of Dharma means to preach. The first sermon of the Buddha at Benares is known as the turning of the wheel of Dharma. The form given here is commonly known as the 8 types of manifestation of the Mahayana. It is said in a sutra that there are some bodhisattvas of this kind who may regress and fall into evil states of existence. But this does not refer to a real retrogression or real regression. It says this merely in order to frighten and stir the heroism of the newly initiated bodhisattvas who have not yet joined the group of the determined and who may be indolent. Furthermore, as soon as the aspiration has been aroused in the bodhisattvas, they leave cowardice far behind them, and are not afraid even of falling into the stage of the followers of the Hinayana. Even though they hear that they must suffer extreme hardship for innumerable eons before they may attain nirvana, they do not feel any fear, for they believe and know that from the beginning of all things are of themselves in nirvana. So I chose to make that the last reading we do from the Awakening of Faith Sutra for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's integral to the understanding of the core teachings of the sutra itself and what Avagosa is trying to get across to us through his wisdom and compassion. But it's also central to the understanding of Buddhism as a whole and why we do these things, why we walk this path in the first place. And that goes back to one word: faith. Now, that word, faith, is very loaded in the West. It has a lot of negative connotations. The word faith and the demand that people have faith has been used to abuse individuals in the past. So people are right to be suspicious. However, we need to understand that the way faith is used in Buddhism is different than the way it's used in other traditions. To have faith doesn't mean that we're not thinking, that we don't have our own discernment, that we're not allowed to ask questions or have doubts, even in the midst of our practice. Quite the opposite. Faith simply means trust and a willingness to try, a willingness to experiment with things. So if I say I have faith in the teachings of the Buddha, that doesn't mean I follow the teachings blindly. It simply means I'm willing to experiment with them and try them out. And as we go about these experiments and we find that, oh, wow, this actually works, that builds up our aspiration. First, it builds up our own faith, which then leads into an aspiration for enlightenment, an aspiration to actualize our enlightenment for our own good and for the good of all sentient beings. This goes back to the Bodhisattva vow. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are endless, I vow to see through them. The teachings are infinite, I vow to learn them. The Buddha way is difficult, I'll walk the path. It's impossible to take those vows without some sort of faith, some sort of trust in what we're doing. I often compare this to the faith we have in our GPS. We don't know where we're going, at least I don't have the time, but the GPS does. But I don't have faith in my GPS just because the manufacturer says I should. I have faith in my GPS because more often than not, it gets me where I'm going. And on the several times when I used the GPS and didn't follow its directions, I ended up getting lost. So when we hear the word faith in Buddhism, we can replace that if that faith word is difficult for us. We can replace that with trust and a willingness to try. And how we develop that faith comes down to 3 practices, which Avagosa explained in the sutra. The first being the examination of karma. Karma, remember, is simply cause and effect. I drank coffee earlier today. That's a cause. The karmic effect of that is sooner or later I'll need to use the restroom. So we examine our own karma and the consequences of our actions. We also examine the karma and the consequences of the actions of others, which is very simple, but it's also very difficult to do. It's almost like playing chess. To be a good chess player, you can't just think about the move you're doing right now. You have to think 3 moves ahead, 5 moves ahead, 7 moves ahead. If I do this, they'll do that. If they do that, I'll do this. If I sacrifice this piece, that'll set up this gambit. So in Buddhism, we learn to play chess with our lives. What am I doing and what are the consequences of this action? If the consequences are good, we continue doing it. If the consequences are negative, if we cause harm to ourselves or others, we stop doing it. Very simple, very hard at the same time. And we don't just study our own karma, we also study the karma of other people as well. We watch them. What are they doing? What are they not doing? Does their actions cause harm? Well, maybe that's an action we should avoid. Does their action cause benefit for themselves or others? Maybe that's something we should do as well. Some of my own great learning came not from the reading of the sutras, though that's important, and we'll go over that in a minute, why it's so important. It came from simply watching and studying my teachers. What were their lives like? How did they interact with other students, with me? When I made mistakes, what did they do? And how did I feel afterwards? How did they seem to feel afterwards? And it was through those kind and compassionate interactions with my own teachers that I gained faith in the practice. Learning about their lives and the struggles they had and how Buddhism helped them overcome, helped awaken a faith in me to walk this path as well. It's similar to knowing someone who's a bodybuilder. If you want to have strong muscles, you find someone who already has strong muscles. If they can do it, whatever method they're using is working, clearly, so I'll give it a try. I'll have some faith in what they're telling me, and we'll see what happens. Doesn't mean I trust them blindly, doesn't mean I don't experiment on my own. It simply means I'm willing to try because I see the karmic effects of their actions. That's why in Dharma Sunday, I like to use pop culture, I like to use politics, I like to use real world events, and then tie those to canonical Buddhist teachings. Because that's training us to study the karmic actions of other people so we can learn what to do and what not to do. And as we learn these lessons, again, we awaken faith in ourselves and in the practice, and then that leads to an aspiration for enlightenment. So I'll use the example of right speech, which is something I struggled with when I first started practicing Buddhism. And there honestly wasn't anything malicious in it. I wasn't trying to hurt people. It's just the way I was raised and the people I was around. That's just how you talk to people. If you were angry, you yelled at someone and you called them names. You put them in their place. Don't test me. Do you know who I am? That's how I was raised. So that's how I talk to people. And it caused a lot of suffering for me and for others, but I didn't realize that it was causing suffering because I never stopped to look at the consequences of my actions. I never studied the karma of what was happening. I said what I said, something happened, I moved on with my life. It wasn't until I started practicing Buddhism And through the practices like meditation and chanting, where I cleared my mind of desires and I was able to see the world clearly, where suddenly I realized, wow, I said something hurtful and it damaged this relationship. Not only did it damage the relationship, but I feel bad. I hurt them and I hurt myself. And then that awakened a faith in me that maybe I should look into this right speech thing. Maybe there's something to it. So I tried it. And lo and behold, if you're nice to people, they tend to be nice to you. Simple, but hard. We make it hard. In the Nirvana Sutra, the Buddha uses the example of a man who's drunk, so drunk that he doesn't recognize his mother or his sister. And so he acts harmfully towards them. It's the same with us. We are drunk on our desires. Remember from the Four Noble Truths, desires cause suffering. The way to end suffering is to end desire. We're so drunk on desire, we can't see the karma of our actions. So an important part of Buddhist practice, the chanting, the meditation, the sutra study, the prostrations, is simply us clearing our minds, calming ourselves, calming our desires enough that we can see what's happening in the world and act accordingly. But because this isn't something we've done habitually, it's something we have to relearn over time. We already know how to do it. We're already Buddhists. We're simply reminding ourselves. So that's the first step to awakening faith. The second is study. It's what we're doing right now. It's attending Dharma talks. It's reading the sutras and other Dharma books. It's discussing Buddhism with our fellow practitioners. Why? Because we're human beings and we have brains. And remember, faith in Buddhism does not mean you stop thinking. It doesn't mean that you don't have questions. Quite the opposite. Faith means I'm asking you questions because I'm interested and I want to know more. Which is why we do a Q&A at the end of all of these talks. And as we have these discussions, as we read the sutras, what happens is we learn things. And some of it resonates with us and some of it doesn't. And that's fine. But every now and then we get a little tidbit, a little aha, a little, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't see it in that way. And as we learn more, our faith grows because we're studying. This is why sutra study is so important. This is why I'm always exhaustively, you're probably sick of me telling you, read the sutras. Even if you don't understand them, study them, because it plants seeds in our minds that eventually grow into something. When I first read the Pre-Land Sutras, they didn't make sense to me. When I first read the Awakening of Faith Sutra, it might as well have been in Sanskrit. I didn't understand. But as we study and those seeds are planted, we learn more and more. And then as we learn more, we put that into practice through karma, again, cause and effect. And not only are we learning it, we're doing the practical application, and then we see the results. A very wholesome, very healthy circle. Our faith grows, our aspiration for enlightenment grows, on and on and on. Everyone benefits through our study. So that's another way that we develop faith. And finally, Avagosa tells us that we develop our faith and we develop this aspiration for enlightenment through compassion. Compassion is so important in Buddhism. Compassion for ourselves and compassion for all sentient beings, which really we are all part of one Buddha body. So compassion for ourselves is compassion for others and vice versa. But we don't normally understand that at the beginning. We think everything is separate, even though it's not. So out of a compassion to end suffering, we awaken a faith. We awaken a willingness to try. When people ask me, how did I start practicing Buddhism? Honestly, it was an act of desperation. I did not want to be morality. I just wanted to live my life and party and have fun. But I was so miserable living that life that out of compassion for myself, I decided to try something else. And as I walked this path, as I spent endless hours on the cushion, as I spent my PTO time going on retreats, as I studied the sutras, as I attended Dharma talks, and my life started to get better, not to say it was perfect, not to say I don't have suffering. This is still samsara after all, but I was just able to deal with it more skillfully. My compassion for myself grew. It grew because I understood that I was a Buddha, that my natural nature was one of enlightenment, and that I did not have to live the way that I was living. Awakening of faith. And then as my practice grew, I began to understand my connections with other people. I developed compassion for them. I realized the ways that I had caused suffering in the past, and I vowed to not do that again. Or if I did make a mistake, which I'm a human being, I'm a Buddhist, I'm not a saint, I vowed that I would try to find a way to make amends, to make things better, out of compassion for them, but also, again, out of compassion for myself, because I realized that they were one and the same. So when we clearly see the suffering of the world, we very naturally want to make it better. I see this sometimes in children who they get money and the first thing they want to do is give it to their parents. Here, mom, you take it. Here, dad, you have some. Because they naturally have that compassion, right? Or maybe we see it in our pets who are having a bad day, we're struggling, and they come and they try to comfort us. Because again, they are Buddhists as well. They naturally have that compassionate urge, that compassionate nature. And because of that, they naturally want to act in a way that ends suffering for themselves and other people, other beings. It's the same with us. As we develop that compassion, we develop that willingness to try, that faith. And as we get results, our faith grows, our aspiration for enlightenment grows. Again, a very wholesome, very healthy circle. But of course, this leads to the question that's always asked in the Mahayana. If we're already Buddhas, why do we have to do any of this? Why is it necessary? Some people think I'm already enlightened, I'm already a Buddha, I can do whatever I want, doesn't matter. I'm still a Buddha. And that's true. There's nothing you can do that will stop you from being a Buddha. There's nothing you can do that can stop you from being an enlightened individual. But acting on that enlightenment is something completely different. Remember, as I've said in previous talks, enlightenment as a state of being and enlightenment as an actualized thing, as an action, those are two separate entities. We learn about our enlightened nature so that we can act as enlightened beings, not so that we can misbehave. So the example that Avagosa gives is of a jewel. I like to use the example of gold. Now, gold is gold from the moment we pull it from the earth, but it oftentimes has defilements, just not because it's good or bad. That's just the nature of being a mineral that comes off the earth. It has copper and some other metals. I can't think of lead, which isn't a metal, but you get the idea. It has to go through a purification process. We as Buddhas are the same. We're gold. But we're gold that needs to go through a purification process. We need to remove our defilements. That's why the awakening of faith, name of the sutra, is so important, because it's the awakening of faith that leads us to try the path. And once we try the path, the practice works on us. And as it works on us, we gain more faith, more willingness to try. And as we keep going and going and going, suddenly we not only realize, we actualize our enlightenment in every moment of daily life. Because we realize there's no separation between us and the rest of the world. There's no moment when we're not a Buddha. This is also why the first noble truth isn't so scary after time. Life is suffering. Okay. Life is suffering. But now we have the tools to deal with it. And now life is suffering, yes, but there's also a great amount of joy in life as well. And we can appreciate that more because we're not creating unnecessary suffering for ourselves. Instead of looking at the sunset and thinking, oh, wow, I wish I could be at home watching TV, we're able to look at the sunset and enjoy the beauty of the sunset because we've eliminated that desire from our mind. Not to say we'll never watch TV again, but in that moment, we enjoy the sunset. Not to say we never have fights with our spouse or our significant other, but we now have tools to speak with them, to interact with them skillfully. So those fights become fewer and farther between. And when we do have disagreements, they're not fights anymore, they're disagreements. And they're a lot more peaceful and a lot more calm. And we don't say things that hurt them as a result, because we're going through that purification process that I mentioned earlier. We're no longer scared of the suffering of the world. So when it comes at us, we're not angry, we're not frightened, we're simply prepared. It's like going outside on a cold winter's day. It can be very miserable if you're not prepared. If I tell you it's 20 degrees outside and we're going to be outdoors for 12 hours, that can be scary. It could be frightening. But if I tell you it's 20 degrees outside, oh, here's some warm boots, here's a warm coat, here's some long johns to put under your clothes, here's a hat and some mittens, we can be out there for 20 hours. I don't care. I'm prepared. Similarly, with the first noble truth of Buddhism, when we say life is suffering, if we're unprepared, that's terrifying. Oh no. But if we are prepared, if we've wrapped ourselves in the power and protection of the Buddha, if we study the karma of our actions, if we studied the sutras, if we developed great compassion for ourselves and other people, suffering is simply part of life. We deal with it, we move on, and we move on to all the joy and happiness of life because we have our faith to keep us strong. We have that aspiration for enlightenment, saving both ourselves and other beings from suffering. Amitabha. So that's talk for today. I hope it was helpful. We will now move into the Q&A portion of this evening's chat. This is your first time tuning in. The Q&A is when you have an option to ask me questions about the sutra reading, about my Dharma talk, about Buddhism in general, or if you simply have questions or comments you'd like to share with the Sangha, also fine. Just type those in the live chat. I'll be sure to respond. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I'll make a few announcements. Meditation and Sutra study is something we do every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It involves a 15-minute guided meditation, a reading from a sutra. Next week, we'll be starting the Nirvana Sutra, a Dharma talk, followed by a Q&A. Every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, we do Dharma Sunday, which is a little shorter. We do a Dharma talk, generally tied to real-world events, and then we also do a Q&A. These teachings are offered free of charge, but if you'd like to make a contribution, information for PayPal and CashApp are in the description for this talk. Let's see. Great Hermit said, "Good evening, Sensei," followed by the bow emoji. Thank you, Great Hermit. Good to see you. You also asked, when is it appropriate to practice noble silence? Most definitely when we're practicing meditation. Chanting is a form of meditation where we're speaking, but if we're practicing seated meditation, noble silence is very important. Also, oftentimes during Buddhist retreats, we'll practice noble silence just because we're trying to eliminate as many distractions as possible. if we're chit-chatting with our neighbors and talking about sports and TV shows, even if we're talking about Buddhism, that can be a distraction. We want to maintain noble silence and go as deeply as possible into our own minds. And then also in day-to-day life, there's a saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That would be a good example of when it's a good time to practice noble silence. When I'm just not in a good space to say something that's skillful and useful to this conversation, whatever I'm going to say is either going to add to negative feelings, or maybe it's just idle chatter. It's not really going to add anything to the conversation. So it's a good time to maintain noble silence. Good question. Divad Buddha X did the bow emoji and said, a smart man learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others. Yes, Divad. 100%. My mother always told me, you don't need to make every mistake in the world. You can learn from other people's mistakes. She doesn't practice Buddhism, but she's clearly a Buddha, because Buddha would agree 100% with that. We can study other people, see what's happening in their lives, and determine what we should and should not be doing. That's what we're doing with sutra study. We're studying the lives of Avagosa, of Dogen, of Shinran, of Vimalakirti, of Buddha, both their mistakes and their affirmations, and we're learning from them. Good insight. Godseed said peace, and then you also said drunk on desires. That's deep. Oh, peace to you as well, friend. Good to have you here. Great Hermit, let's see. You said, Sensei, have you heard of the parable of the confused lion? It's a parable of a lion who grew up believing he is a sheep because he got separated from his mother and found himself in a herd of sheep. Until one day, another lion told him that he is a lion. Although the confused lion knew he was a lion, he continued to act like a sheep out of habit. The lion who told him that he was a lion gave him a mirror so that the confused lion would be reminded that he is a lion. Yeah, I think I have heard that. I'm trying to think where. Maybe it was Tony Robbins. I'm not sure. But I'm familiar with that parable, and it's a good one. It's beautiful. And it's a great example of what we're doing in Buddhism. Buddha, the patriarchs and matriarchs who came after him, are simply holding up a mirror. This is who you really are. Buddha, start acting like one. And then even though we know we're Buddhas, out of habit, like you said, we're drunk on desires, so we don't behave that way. It just takes time. We have to give ourselves, some room. Habits are hard to break, but we also have to be willing to try. Again, going back to the importance of faith towards the aspiration of enlightenment. And as we develop that willingness to try, we're able to break those negative habits. We're able to become the lion that Buddha knows we are. Excellent, Great Hermit. Thank you for sharing that. Divad Buddha X said, I've read that a fortune teller predicted Buddha's future. How was he able to do this? So fortune telling was very common in the time of Buddha. It is actually still very common in certain parts of India. When a child is born, they would look at the stars that they were born under. They would look at various other things and tell the future. Right down to when they were expected to die and what types of work that they would do. The fortune teller, after looking at the stars of the Buddha, said that he would either be a world-turning monarch or he would be a world-turning holy man. And this kind of set the Buddha on his path indirectly, because his father, trying to keep that from happening, kept him locked away in the palace, made sure he had every pleasure imaginable. And this was important because I think Buddha also came to spirituality out of an act of desperation. He had everything that was supposed to make him happy, and it didn't. So he tried something else. Well, it's the same with us on a much smaller scale. But to get back to your initial question, it was just a very common practice back then, still is. They would look at the stars, they would look at the lives of your parents, what caste you were born into. They may do other divinations, and through that practice, they were able to determine what they thought your fortune would be. Kendra Jones asked, how many sutras are there, and which would you recommend a beginner to read first? There are countless sutras. There are quite a many. We will, through meditation sutra study, be going through the Mahayana sutras. This is a Mahayana Buddhist Sangha. So we'll probably do 10 or 12 this year. We've done the Lotus Sutra and the Vimalakirti Sutra already. So if you look at previous meditation and sutra study recordings, you can learn about those. What would be a good one to start for a beginner? Actually, what I would recommend, Kendra, instead of starting with a sutra as a beginner, I would recommend you start with the Dhammapada. And what that is a series of aphorisms or sayings that were said by the Buddha in various sutras. They were all brought together in one place. And what the Dhammapada does is kind of give you the flavor of Buddhism, the idea, what are we doing? Why are we here? What are some of the core philosophies? But it's posited in a way that's very simple, very easy to understand. So not technically a sutra, but the Dhammapada is the words of Buddha. And I'd recommend that a beginner start there. In terms of an actual sutra to start with, I'd have to think a little bit about that one. Maybe the Vimalakirti Sutra would be good, because that's written from the perspective of a layperson. Vimalakirti was not an ordained monk. He was a wealthy business person who became a Buddhist teacher. So a lot of the teachings there are offered from the perspective of a layperson. Now, there is a lot of Buddhist cosmology there, so some of it may go over your head, which is fine. But I think it will plant some good seeds in the mind of a beginner. So I would start there, probably with the Dhammapada first. But if you really want to dive headfirst into a sutra, I'd start with the Vimalakirti Sutra. Wonderful question. And thank you. Glad to have you back again this week. David Oliver did the bell emoji. Good to have you here, David. Kendra Jones said, are there different variations of Buddhism? Absolutely. In the same way that there's different denominations of Christianity, for example, there are many different denominations of Buddhism. And the core thing, this is a non-sectarian Buddhist Sangha, meaning that I, as a teacher, don't belong to any particular tradition or lineage, though my training was in the Pure Land and Zen tradition. So if you were to look at my teachings, you'd probably find the most direct lines to either Pure Land or Zen. However, two things. First, the way you know what's a legitimate Buddhist school and what's not is the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. These are the core of Buddha's teachings. So any Buddhist teaching that you're given should be in accordance with those. So that's how you can determine, is this teaching legitimate or not? Now, in terms of the various Buddhist schools, as long as they're in keeping with the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, they're equally legitimate. My recommendation, if you're looking for a school for your own practice, is to experiment, try different ones, and see what resonates with you. So some people like the silent illumination practice of Zen, so they're attracted to Soto Zen, for example. Some people prefer the chanting and the otherworldly nature, the esoteric practices of Pure Land and Nichiren Buddhism, so they're attracted there. So just experiment with different Buddhist schools as you come across, see which ones resonate with you, which ones don't. But yeah, as long as it's in accordance with the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, that's kind of the litmus test to see, is this Buddhist sect legitimate or not? Great Hermit asks, what is the difference between metaphysics and existential philosophy? That's a good question. I can't think of a dictionary definition of metaphysics and existential philosophy off the top of my head, but my BA was in philosophy and the focus was on existential philosophy. I would say there's a lot of crossover between the two. Metaphysics and existential philosophy kind of go hand in hand. Both of them have the goal of trying to explain the unexplainable. Why are we here? What are we supposed to do with our lives? Why do bad things happen to good people? So there's a lot of crossover between existential philosophy and metaphysics. I would say the primary difference, if we really wanted to cut them to pieces, is that existential philosophy is more of an intellectual pursuit, whereas metaphysics to a certain extent is more of a faith-based practice. I can't see this, I can't taste this, I can't touch this, but I believe it's there, right? Whereas existential philosophy is us more trying to winnow things out through our minds, right? So that's just kind of off the top of my head, how I describe the differences between the two, but they're very closely related. Great Hermit also asks, what are the rules that will always guarantee that we're going to be reborn as a human or higher? Those would be the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. Also, the precepts, keeping the precepts, especially the first 5, are the most important. To not kill, to not lie, to not steal, to not abuse intoxicants, to not abuse sexuality. If you're doing those 3 things, keeping the precepts, adhering to the Noble Eightfold Path, and adhering to and studying the Four Noble Truths, it would be pretty difficult for you to not be born as a human or higher. So, yeah, simple. Great Hermit also said, Sensei, I'm almost done with your book. And then, do you still dislike Monopoly board game? Well, first off, I'm really glad that you're almost done with the book. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Wonderful. In terms of Monopoly, just so this makes sense. So I wrote a book for everyone else, Perfectly Ordinary, Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life, where I take the core tenets of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, and the Noble Eightfold Path. And I use my own life experiences working in corporate America, working on farms, dealing with my family and the drama associated with that, to explain the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which again are the cornerstone, the main tenets of Buddhism, to explain how they work and how they can help us in daily life. So there's a link to a sample chapter of the book in the description for this chat. It's available everywhere books are sold. What Great Hermit is referring to is there's a chapter where I talk about Monopoly and how there was time where I just refused to play Monopoly with my family because we always ended up arguing. Someone always ended up crying. It just wasn't fun. It was very cutthroat. But over time, what ended up happening was we worked out a way to play the game where it was fun and wasn't causing harm to us. So there was a time limit. We only play for 30 minutes. And whoever has the most money at the end of 30 minutes, that's who wins. And there were some other rules as well, but that was probably the main one, the most important one. Also, some things, no teaming up on other people. So the 2 people with the most money can't team up and, hey, you don't have to pay rent if you land on my property. So no one feels like they're being bullied, right? And so what ended up happening is because we played a lot of board games at my house, and Monopoly was one of them, I was able to spend time with my family and friends. I was able to play Monopoly, but not, dread it every time it came up. To answer your question, Great Hermit, I still have a little about Monopoly. I've played it a few times as an adult, and it didn't go well. But I'm better able to deal with it now. I don't take it quite so seriously. I'm willing to just, I don't think this is working. I'm going to go do something else. So I wouldn't say I dislike Monopoly anymore, but I still, if I have a choice, I'll play something else. Great Hermit said, I have a few more questions, or I got a few more questions. Absolutely. That's why I'm here. Kendra Jones said, is the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path the same as the 10 Worlds? No. So those are separate. So the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, just to give you some backstory, when Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and realized his own enlightenment, he had an experience that couldn't be put into words. So when he came up from the Bodhi tree and went out into the world, he created a path that people could follow to have the same realization that he had, to realize their own Buddha nature in the same way that he realized his Buddha nature under the Bodhi tree. Now, the first thing that needs to happen is we have to have a clear understanding of the world and how that works. So that's the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. The way to end suffering is to end desire. The way to end desire is the Noble Eightfold Path. So those are the Four Noble Truths. So what I going over the Dharma talk and saying we're drunk on desire, so we can't see the karma of our actions, so that's why we cause harm. What I was referring to, what Avagosa was referring to, was the Four Noble Truths. Now, the Noble Eightfold Path is the practical application of Buddhism. We understand the teachings. How do we put this out into daily life? So that's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Okay, so as we move through the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddhism, again, the practical application, the philosophy of Buddhism, the moral tenets of Buddhism, or the wisdom teachings of Buddhism, rather, in right view and right intention, the moral tenets of right speech, right action, right livelihood, and then finally the meditative tenets, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, we're able to enter nirvana, inner peace, and as we enter nirvana, we realize our own enlightened nature. Now, what we do in meditation and sutra study, the reason the format is laid out as it is it's designed to move us through the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. We touch all of that every Wednesday, starting at 6:30. And as we go through that cycle over and over and over again, going back to the reading, we awaken our faith and our willingness to try. We awaken our aspiration towards enlightenment, and we get glimpses of the Dharmakaya, glimpses of our own Buddha nature. So that's what we do every Wednesday. We get a glimpse. We hold up the mirror to see who we really are. And as we see that, week after week after week, we're able to actualize our enlightenment in everyday life in the same way that the Buddha did. Good question, Kendra. Great Hermit said, why is Japanese Buddhism so lax? You also said you used to work on the farm. What do you do now? And then you finally said, do hungry ghosts actually have a small mouth, long neck, and a pot belly? Or is it an analogy? And finally, how does water offering help them? So first, why is Japanese Buddhism so lax? Well, honestly, I'm not sure Japanese Buddhism is lax. I know we in the West like to think it is because we think we do everything better than everyone else. But I think what's happened in Japanese Buddhism is they've integrated the teachings into their daily life. So if we look at the way someone practices in a temple, for example, there's in Japanese Buddhism a very strong focus on work practice. Now, we may look at that and why aren't we meditating? Why aren't we chanting? Why are we working in the garden so much? And the reason for that is because in Japanese Buddhism, the way you work in the garden is Buddhist practice. We're meditating as we work, as we rake the leaves, as we dump out the garbage. We're chanting as we move through the temple and go about various tasks. So on the surface, it looks lax, but it's actually a very disciplined practice. But it's a practice that's integrated with daily life. Now, the reason for that is going back to history. So in India, when they were practicing Buddhism, monasticism was common. So you could withdraw from the world and people would support you if they knew you were a spiritual teacher. So there was no work practice for that reason. You were able to spend long hours studying sutras because other people would feed you, other people would clothe you, other people would give you a place to sleep. What happened when Buddhism came to places like Korea, like Japan, like China, is that support wasn't there. In fact, some Indian Buddhist monks left those places and went back to India thinking, we can't practice Buddhism here. But what others did is they changed the practice to integrate it with what was already happening. So for example, with working in the garden, people weren't supporting the monks and the nuns with food offerings as much as they were in India. So they had to grow their own food. So what happened is because they had to grow their own food, they turned the growing of food, they turned the farming, they turned the agriculture into spiritual practice. So we're not just out here growing food to grow food, we're out here growing food to become Buddhists. They turned the cleaning of the temples because there aren't people coming to the temples to clean them for them like you would see in places like India. They turned the cleaning of the floors into spiritual practice. Again, looks lax on the surface because we don't understand, but once you understand the teachings more readily, you understand they're practicing very diligently. And it's the same with us in daily life. The way we wash the dishes, the way we cut the grass, the way we eat our dinner, all of that is Buddhist practice. All of that is enlightenment if we do it with the right mindset and the right intention. So that's why sometimes we get the idea that Buddhism is lax in Japan because it has more of that focus. Now, also, there were some other things that happened. Because the temples were generally passed down from father to son in Japan, and because they've experienced persecution in the past, they had to integrate in certain ways. So sometimes you'll see Japanese Buddhist practitioners who eat meat or who drink alcohol. And I don't think they're being lax necessarily. I think they're using expedient means. That this is it's what's necessary for Buddhism to continue in Japan. And I defer to their judgment, not living in Japan myself. You also asked, you used to work on a farm. What do you do now? Well, currently I'm in the process of starting my own homestead. So I'm still farming, I guess. Yeah, I also have a day job. I work in an office, but my primary work is to work on the homestead, grow food for my household so that we can support ourselves and spend more and more of my time doing ministry work like this. So I guess you could say I'm still farming. Only now I'm just farming for myself, not for other people. Do hungry ghosts actually have a small mouth, long neck, and a pot belly, or is it an analogy? I would say they probably still have that. It is an analogy. The short neck, the long neck rather, and the small mouth is a symbol of the fact that they are trying to get food in, but they can't. The pot belly is if you have, I believe it's a protein deficiency, what ends up happening is your stomach produces gas and your stomach expands and you have that pot belly. So you look like you've eaten a lot when you haven't. So it's an analogy, but my experience as hungry ghosts is that they also look like that as well. How does the water offering help them? So it's an act of compassion. Again, the awakening of faith being an awakening of compassion. We know they're hungry, so we try to feed them. The water offering is something that they, with their long necks and their small mouths, can take in easily because it's liquid. So that's what we do. So what I've generally seen in Buddhist temples is people will take their food, they'll wash out their bowls, and then they'll take that water, which has food particles in it, and they'll give that as the offering. We offer that to the hungry ghost. They're able to drink that, and that assuages a bit of their suffering. So we're showing them compassion in that way. So it benefits them, but it also benefits us. Anytime we can be compassionate to others, we're also being compassionate to ourselves. Good question. Great Hermit also asked, will American Buddhism have to adapt Buddhist teachings as well? Since there's lack of support for the monastery here, do you think that the priests will have to work and teach Dharma too? Yes. I think you hit the nail on the head, Great Hermit. I think that will become the norm. I think in American Buddhism, it's very unlikely that you'll find people who are able to teach Dharma full time and that's all they do. For various reasons, one being the general lack of support from the public. Also, just the fact that it's very difficult to live simply here in the West. So part of the reason that the Buddha and his monks were able to live off of donations is because they were able and allowed to live so simply. They could have 2 robes and a bowl. They could sleep under trees. So their requirements for day-to-day were very low. So they required, frankly, very little support from the public in order to sustain themselves. Here in the West, there are literally laws against sleeping outside. You can be arrested for loitering and vagrancy, right? If you build a home, I've researched this in the building of my homestead. It has to be hooked up to the city's power and sewer, etc., or they'll get a fine, right? It's literally against the law. So as a result of that, I think in American Buddhism, more and more what we're already seeing is that Buddhist ministers, priests, monks, nuns, etc., will have jobs in addition to teaching the Dharma. Maybe that will change. Maybe we'll receive more support from the public. But as of right now, I think that will be the case. And I think that's fine. I think that's better, honestly. In order to support ourselves as Buddhist teachers, what would be required would be to charge for the Dharma. And I have no problem with teachers who charge for teacher trainings, for example, or who charge to go on retreats, because things have expenses. But the amount of money that would need to be charged to people who are really trying to support themselves 100% from the Dharma, I think would cause it to not be available to the people who need it. So I think it's better for teachers, frankly, to have day jobs, even if that makes them slightly less available to their sanghas, because then they can offer teachings on a donation basis, like this. But to answer your question, yes, I think Buddhism will have to adapt, and it will, as it's already doing. Allison Griffin said, Namo Amida Butsu with the bow emoji. Namo Amida Butsu, Allison. Thank you so much for joining us. Great Hermit asks, can you see ghosts, Sensei? I heard monks and advanced Dharma practitioners can see them. Sometimes. It's definitely not a day-to-day thing. It's generally when I'm on retreat. And I've just been meditating for 10 hours a day and chanting endlessly, that I'll start to see things and I'll be very sensitive to energies because the distractions of daily life have kind of gone away. So I'm more able to pick on in those subtle energies, which is nothing that's special about me. That's just something that happens with practice, is you become very sensitive to the rest of the world. So I've had experiences, I've seen things when I was on retreat, but only on retreat in my experience. Otherwise, I've got other things going on, so I'm just not picking up on those energies. Great Hermit asks, how come the gods don't associate with us? Honestly, probably for the same reason we don't associate with ants. their answers are just so different from us. Insights are so different from us that we notice them, but we don't sit down and study them and try to have conversations. And it's the same thing with us and the gods. We're just different. So different, in fact, that they kind of don't notice us. Now, there are exceptions. When we look at the life of Buddha and the sutras, he interacted with the gods quite a bit because he was a deeply realized individual, that he was able to gain their notice. So having conversations with Indra or with Brahma, or other celestial beings because of that. But generally speaking, the gods just really aren't interested in us. They're wrapped up in their own lives. Great Hermit asks, have you ever had a conversation with any spirits? Good question. I'm not in the way you probably mean conversation. I've definitely had things communicated to me. I've definitely had feelings when I've gone into various places, but the spiritual realm is so different than the earthly realm that it's kind of like us trying to talk to fish. We know enough about fish that we know what's going on, what's good, bad, what's happening, what's not happening, but we're not really talking. When we talk about human beings in the spiritual realm, it's the same thing. We can sense things, we can feel things if we're sensitive to that, but it's not really a conversation like you and I are having a conversation right now. And honestly, just to be blunt, I kind of try to ignore the spiritual realm. Not to say that that's not important or that spirits are not worthy of our compassion. I engage in all the rituals, all the offerings for hungry ghosts and the like, but I think it can be dangerous if we get too involved in the spirit realms, in the heaven realms, etc. We can lose track of this realm. We can start practicing for the wrong reasons. Well, I want to practice meditation in Buddhism because I want to talk to ghosts, or I want to practice meditation in Buddhism because I want Brahman to come speak to me. And that's not the goal of Buddhism. The goal of Buddhism is to realize enlightenment and in suffering for ourselves and others. That's why if you have a sort of spiritual experience, if you see a ghost, if you have a great, happening in spirituality and you talk to your Zen teacher, your Pure Land teacher about it, they won't call you a liar. They'll listen, they'll be polite, and then they'll say, okay, that's cool. Go practice some more. Because we don't want to be distracted, right? Sometimes as human beings, we think these other realms are higher or better. But in reality, they're all part of the same realm. They're all part of samsara. And our goal as Buddhists it's to explore samsara and learn about it, but primarily it's to escape samsara, to end suffering. And we can't do that if we're too, how do I talk to ghosts? How do I talk to the gods, right? So those things are there. I believe in them, but I don't put a lot of energy in that direction for that reason. I think it can be dangerous and potentially detrimental to practice. Andrew Dodd said, first time watching, love that you're promoting the Dharma. Well, thank you, Andrew. So wonderful to have you. Thank you. I hope you join us again. And yeah, I appreciate that encouragement. Thank you so much. Great Hermit, put some arrows there. I think you're saying you agree with Andrew Dodd's comment. Wonderful. You also asked, can you get psychic powers from Vipassana and meditation? So this kind of goes back to what I said before. It's possible. I've read sutras and accounts of monks and nuns who were able to see past lives, who were able to hear sounds long distances away, things like that. Certainly possible. Even if we look at the Buddha, he's said to have had powers like what you just described because of the power of his practice. I think a lot of that goes back to your past lives, the karma you're bringing into this one. So if you were a monk or a nun for many lives leading up to this one, you may gain those abilities, but again, I don't think that type of thing is very important. I'm more of the school of Layman Peng. When he was asked, what supernatural powers do you have? He said, I chop wood, I carry water. So that's what I focus on: chopping wood, carrying water, working in my homestead, taking care of my animals. I think that's really where we find the root and the fruit of spiritual practice, is in those simple everyday moments. Great Hermit also asked, I'm not sure if you're asking, you said, have you remembered your past lives? So I'm not sure if you're asking if I've remembered my own past lives or if it's possible to remember your past lives. I haven't had any of those experiences where I remember, in the past life I did this, or, I was this individual in the past life. So no, never had that experience. I've talked to monks who have, but I personally have not. No. Michael Hill did the bow emoji. Oh, thank you, Michael. Wonderful to have you here. Very kind. Great Hermit asked, do you plan on going on a pilgrimage someday? Yes. I definitely see that in my future. I'm not sure how that would work exactly. It would be hard, to be blunt, for me to be away from the Sangha for that long, an extended period of time. But I do think at some point I will go on a pilgrimage, maybe do another long retreat. But I promise if I do that, I'll let everyone know. So no plans for right now, but I do plan on doing that again. Would you like to visit Bodh Gaya? Good question. And yes, I would. I think that's a useful thing to do. I think it'd be cool to sit where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and meet all the other Buddhists who are there, also trying to soak in, be permeated by suchness, by the Dharma. So one day, Buddha willing, I'd like to visit Bodh Gaya. Yes. So any other comments, questions, concerns this evening before we end? Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I hope to see you Sunday. And if not, for Dharma Sunday, I hope to see you Wednesday for Meditation and Sutra study when we start the Nirvana Sutra. Amitabha. Oh, one more question. Great Hermit asks, are you planning on studying just Zen and Pure Land, or are you also interested in other practices? So that's a good question. Buddhism is just so big, such a large umbrella, so many different teachings and practices, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Theravada. And then in each of those vehicles, there's so many different schools. I would say my focus right now is on the Pure Land and Zen teachings, just because as a teacher, I feel it's better that I know a few things extremely well than to know a lot of things not so well. So my focus is primarily on Pure Land and Zen, with a larger focus on the Mahayana Buddhism schools in general. But I am interested in other practices, but I'd say probably Zen and Pure Land are where I'm putting most of my focus right now, because like I said, I feel as a minister, it's more important to be an expert in a few things and be able to go very deeply into them than to have only a smattering of knowledge of a lot of things. But excellent question. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Amitabha.